Correction officers of Reddit, have you ever met an inmate that was actually a very nice person but did absolutely horrifying crimes? If so, what's their story? From my personal experience, the nicest inmates are usually the ones who have committed the worst crimes: murder, act. The ones that always give you problems are the guys that get arrested for minor crap like petty theft, cannabis, loitering. They always come in with major attitudes that never ends well. Former CO here. I had 2 guys in my unit that strangled their newborns when they wouldn't stop crying. One of them was drinking and trying to watch a hockey game. His daughter wouldn't stop crying. He got annoyed, walked over and just choked her until she stopped. The other guy's story was somewhat similar, but I can't remember the details. They were both porters in that housing unit. They were doing a lot of time. Can't remember exactly how much they were given. One guy was already at year 16. Probably 2 of the nicest guys I met while on the job. They didn't come off as crazy degenerates and seemed like genuinely nice guys. I used to stand in the day room and have some interesting convos with them and their little crew they called the Trailer Trash Circle or something to that effect. I tutored in juvie. One of the boys had murdered 3 people for a gang initiation and when asked, had absolutely no remorse for it. He was a very nice, polite, and intelligent kid though who would draw me little pictures and always tried extra hard on his creative writing assignments. Had a very good sense of humor too and often made everyone in the room laugh and smile. I honestly had trouble reminding myself that he was a cold-blooded murderer. My dad worked as a doctor in a prison for a short time, came back with lots of stories of the inmates. He said he talked to one guy who was always friendly and chill. Found out the guy had a life sentence and asked the guy why he was in prison. The guy said he had a bad lawyer. My dad looked up his information later on and it turned out he had murdered his own daughter. So yay, never judge a book by its cover. Or maybe he was innocent and had a bad lawyer. Not a CO but worked in a psych ward. In this case the guy went to prison and was eventually stepped down to our psych ward. He had stabbed his dad multiple times and killed him. He was with us for around a year so I saw him 5-6 times a week, anywhere from 8-14 hours each shift. He was so kind and polite. You would never think he had done anything remotely shocking. When his relationship with his dad would come up he would talk so calmly and normally, no real hatred or anger. Yet he murdered him. If there were ever fights on the ward he would look out for staff and other patients. I won't lie, he was a delight. TLDR, worked with a murderer. He was one of my nicest patients. Not a company. RN here. I've taken care of a fair amount of detained prisoners that have been admitted to the hospital. I usually ask them what got them locked up cause I'm nosy. I had one super pleasant middle-aged guy tell me his story. Apparently he and his wife were going through or had gone through an ugly split. They were already separated when someone broke into his house with a weapon intending to hurt him. He wound up killing the guy in self-defense. I assume he had a gun or something, but not before he found out his wife had arranged it. She hired a hitman to come kill him, but instead of going to the police after, he went to his wife's place and killed her outright. Super friendly guy though. No idea how much of that was true but that's definitely the craziest story I've heard from an inmate. If you're ever curious you can ask the officers watching the inmate. They might not know details but they have a rap sheet that summarizes crimes committed. None of it is privileged information, and most COs actually appreciate nurses caring about safety and security. 2 stories in one. I worked as a CO for a private prison in TN before I moved with my fiance to VA. One of our units had a guy who was always generally nice and respectful. He was the stand-up comic of the group in that unit. He would speak with any new young guys that came in, led the prayer group for guys on Sundays in the day room etc etc. My last day in the state before I moved, his name was on the news. Turns out he was in jail for vehicular manslaughter while driving under the influence of M. Needless to say I was quite shocked by the crime because he didn't seem to be that guy. The other story comes from when I was a student in community college. I got the chance to do interviews on death row in TN. Most death row inmates were the most respectful and honest men I've ever met. We wouldn't speak about their cases due to legal reasons that could cause problems with their appeals, but we would ask questions about their lives and families. One of the guys was a phenomenal artist. You could give him a picture of something and he would draw it out with pencils. It would look exactly like the picture you had given him. People still look at me in shock when I tell them that death row was the most calm and chill time I've ever spent in a corrections environment. I even felt the safest working with these gentlemen and their unit because they policed their own behavior. XCO here. Had a man who shot and killed one state trooper and shot another in the groin. He sat as a sniper in the woods and shot the troopers through the windows of the barracks. It was premeditated and he nearly got away with it. He was on FBI most wanted list for a good 2 months. The marshals caught him as he was getting ready to take off on a hang glider. Anyway, he was the most mild-mannered inmate I had met. Always reading, never turned down his afarek, always finished his plate, etc. Anyway, I was doing an escort with another officer to take him to visitation. He was to wear double-locked shackles and cuffs when not in his cell, even in the showers. I was holding his arm and assisting him so he wouldn't trip, and I felt his bicep flex and he just stopped walking and looked at me. I realized at that moment that he could overpower me without much effort, shackles or not. Turns out he just had to sneeze. My point is that whether someone is mild-mannered or more primitive has no effect on human capabilities. Cold-blooded color. For a more accurate picture, I am a 5'8", 125 pound female. I'm a senior officer with my department, and I can say from my perspective that this happens quite a lot. When I was a rookie, I worked with an inmate who was serving life with parole for multiple sexual assault charges and escaped from county jail. But I remember always thinking to myself that he seemed like a completely normal guy who hadn't let the prison politics get to him at all. He was one of my culinary workers and he would always do any job I asked of him without question or attitude. And to top it all off, he was a military veteran who would even reminisce with our sergeant, who was also a veteran, about their past deployments. It was so bizarre to see someone who could have very well been my neighbor serving such a lengthy sentence for such an awful crime. Corrections nurse here. Never interacted with this inmate. I just see him out on the yard as I come into work. He collects bread crusts and I always see him feeding the birds. And the birds trust him and fly straight to his hand to eat. He looks like a nice enough guy from a distance. And birds only land on the hands of Disney princesses, right? Well, one day I caught him in a moment. A particularly fat pigeon landed on his hand and bent down to eat. He closed his fist on the pigeon's head and flicked his wrist to snap its neck. Its body was still flailing as he calmly put it into his pocket and then put out his hand again to feed more birds. I was told he was going to cook and eat it, which made me feel a little better, but still. And that's what comes to my mind every time an inmate is nice to me. Not a CO, but I did work in a prison. Lots of inmates were seemingly decent people. One guy in particular was a hitman. He and his story were well known at the time. When I met him, I had no idea who he was and wondered what he could have done to land in prison. When I found out who he was, I read one of the books about him. That guy was pretty brutal. I always imagined professional hitmen would be the most likely to be nice people. Well, as nice as you can be when your job is literally killing people for money. That said, probably low empathy, so very capable of doing very fricked up crap. I was a federal parolee counselor working in a halfway house reacclimation program. Most of my clients were capital offenders coming out of 20+ prison stints. Most of the clients were actually great people at face value, outside of drug distribution, which most of my clients were in prison for. I had murderers, rapists, major assault and child molesters, as well as some pretty notorious biker gang guys, who all have committed some heinous crimes but usually get busted for a slough of less violent things. Indiana biker gangs, for example, were big on rolling casinos and auto theft, so that's what they'd get slammed for. I gotta say that I don't remember having a single client who wasn't a nice person. It's easy to read their files and go, holy crap, this guy is demented as frick, but you learn to desensitize to that and do your job at reacclimating them back into society. I did have one guy who was caught moderating a child pee ring and served 18 years of his 25-year sentence. He was on lithium, chlorpromazine and benztropine. Very strange guy. Feeble, soft-spoken, very small frame, probably around 65 years old and genuinely kind. That is until one day when he refused his meds for some goddamn reason. He walked right into my office on a scheduled education verification check and went berserk. Flipped my desk, stabbed himself in the neck with a pencil, threatened to sodomize my whole family, and ended up laying on the ground trying to chew the wood leg of my desk. This all happened in about 20 seconds before we could restrain him and call the police. I'd never seen such a blatant portrayal of a mental health issue in my life. Still freaks me up to this day. I have a lot of random stories about my clients, but most are positive, and most of those guys were easy to get along with and great people if you didn't know their history. Holy crap, that was frightening to even read. Former company, absolutely all the time. I usually found myself having pleasant conversations with inmates almost like they are old buddies, only to find out they are in for horrendous crimes. Had one guy who was super kind, trying to give me advice. I was a 19-year-old, fresh-faced CO, about how to manage inmates with my inferior age and size. Super kind and respectful. I looked him up on our system to see what he was in for, expecting something small, to find he was in for murder and arson in the first degree. Honestly, the both comforting and terrifying thing is majority of inmates are just like everyone else who just have made bad, some really bad, choices. TV greatly over-exaggerates criminals to be sociopaths, set in their ways, and inhumane. It puts into perspective how easily you could be on the other side of the bars. That last sentence should be a reminder for anyone. It is easy to get oneself in a situation when you might overreact or make a in hindsight dumb choice. Not all criminals are serial killers or members of gangs. The majority of murders happen in a friend-family setting for a reason. Former caseworker, state prison, CO, and jailer. Frequently the people you meet interact in a normal manner. If I didn't know what their past was, you wouldn't be able to guess. 3 are most assuredly exceptions to this. I've had inmates on my caseload that most definitely did not deserve prison. I've also had a few that I have no issue believing they have no soul. I work in juvenile corrections. There are a lot of pretty nice kids that have done some pretty fricked up crap. One in particular is a little 12-year-old that gets constantly picked on by the other inmates because he is short and he has bowel problems, so he has to wear diapers. Turns out he molested multiple little kids, would trap rats to break their spines, and had a habit of throwing cats off of tall buildings to see if they land on their feet. That just screams traumatized by early childhood sexual abuse. Supervisor here. I run chow each morning, and a while back there was a guy who would come through the line each morning smiling and being quite friendly and personable, saying "Good morning, Lieutenant." He was friendly enough that I had never bothered to look him up as far as his crime details. Much later I go to his unit to visit the officer and notice a strange open letter on the officer's desk. I ask about it and the officer tells me, "Oh yeah, that's from Jones. He's been trying to get back to his Caribbean country for years. Turns out the guy has dual citizenship and wants to get transferred there. He can't though because his crime was committed in our state. He had gotten in a big argument with his wife outside his house one winter night and beat her to death and then cut off her head. He then took the head and left the body on the doorstep. Even more messed up was that he left their 2-year-old with the body. Police later received a call about a crying child and found the kid holding onto his dead mother in the snow. The kid was cold but unharmed. The inmate still comes through the line just as friendly as can be. I wish him good morning in return, but keep a bit closer eye on him now that I know his background. Former inmate here. Long story short, I was sentenced to state prison for selling small amounts of marijuana. And during my time in the high security classification facility, I enrolled in a Jewish study group to meet people and pass the time. One of the other regular members happened to be a former professor of economics from UPenn, specializing in game theory, who happened to be a really nice and personable guy if you could just look past the fact he was there for beating his wife to death with a crowbar over a divorce settlement. Needless to say, we made a lot of prisoner's dilemma jokes. I think the most upsetting part of this story is that selling a small amount of marijuana sends you the same place as the guy who beat his ex-wife to death. I worked in a small prison in Germany. Now and then, when the other prisons in the area were over capacity, we'd get the odd weekend guest, mostly abusive spouses who were locked up for a few days so had the chance to pack a few bags in peace to get away. Drunks who'd gone on a rampage, that kind of thing. I worked there for 8 years, and during that time there was one guy who was a recurring guest. He was in his late 50s, always well dressed, very friendly, educated, extremely compliant with our rules. quiet, basically the kind of inmate you want if you work in a place like this. As a woman, I never had much to do with him, but my colleagues always reported that the guy was almost a joy to meet and work with. He was a stalker. The object of his obsession was a young woman from his small town neighborhood. He'd relentlessly terrorized her for the better part of 10 years, starting when she was in her late teens. Thousands of phone calls, letters, attempts to get into her parents' house apartment, not sure which it was, following her on the streets. The stalker laws, when it started, basically said that as long as he didn't do anything to her physically, there was nothing that could be done. I have no idea why the family didn't move away from that town to protect her. The times he was locked up, it was for attempts of breaking and entering. He ended up killing her. Well, that escalated, man. I am not a CO, but I work in addictions recovery. You realize that everyone is fundamentally the same when you get wrecked in a game of Magic the Gathering by a Latino gangbanger with teardrop tattoos. That guy could sling spells like nobody's booziness. He was also really good at killing people apparently. Not a corrections officer, but I went on a trip to a prison in college in the UK a few years back. Met a bunch of inmates and sat in this room with a bunch of my classmates, with them sitting intermingled with us. We chatted with them and there was one guy that seemed really nice and genuine. When asked why he was in there, he explained that there were a gang of guys that broke into his mate's house during a party, hit the guy's girlfriend with a hammer and robbed the people there. I could be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure that was the gist. He then said that his mate called him to go beat the crap out of the guy that did it and he agreed to help his mate out. It got out of hand. His mate killed the guy after he had conveniently left and then he was arrested and sent to prison. We kinda sympathized with him and he seemed like a nice guy. Once we had left the prison, one of the officers explained what had really happened. Apparently it was in the local news when it had happened. Turns out him and his mate had gone to the guy's house, beat the crap out of him and then used hammers to fricking mince his body and ran over it with a car a few times. When the body was found, they said it was so disfigured they didn't know where the head on it was. The idea that a guy that I'd sat next to and shaken hands with had done that was quite strange. I interned at a mental health ward for kids. On my first day, I just played cards and basketball with all the kids to get to know them. One girl stuck out to me. She was a little kooky, but had a great sense of humor and was amazing at Uno. I described her as a budding card shark to my internship group. On my second day, I read the kids' files. Miss Card Shark was in there for killing her family's dog. I was so shaken, I considered asking to switch to a different internship, but ended up staying. MCS had actually been there for 2 years and was in the final stages of successful treatment, so for the rest of my time with her, she was just like any other kid. It was definitely weird, though, when she was playing games with other kids and would jokingly say, "I'll kill you." I am a CO. Twice a week I go and get an inmate to clean up officers in the facility. He has access to lots of things he could kill me with, has killed people, and as a former shot caller, has had lots of people beat down, stabbed, and some killed. I love to read, and this guy has read pretty much every book written, as he's been in seg so much that he just read all day, all the time. Since I don't share any personal details with inmates, whether they just stole a truck or killed kids or talked in theaters real heinous crap, you know, and keep my life on lockdown, books are a safe topic. He is very smart and has a grasp of literature and its impact that is refreshing and enjoyable. I love talking with Garnell, made up name, about books while he cleans, and I make sure he doesn't get into off-limits areas or kill anyone. Worked on Texas death row as a CO from 2003 to 2005, then again a little later from 2006 to 2007. The whole experience was pretty wild, but very controlled. Every time an inmate was taken out of their cell, they were handcuffed, some in even more restrictive restraints. We even had cameras installed in some of the very high risk for offense cells, and had those dudes on 24-hour in-cell surveillance. It took me a solid year to feel comfortable walking into the cell blocks, but it became very routine. Only on rare occasions did those routines become construed, and you can bet your bottom dollar that when they became construed, you would hear all types of crap from inmates and officers alike. But there was an inmate I remember always keeping his complete cool, whether we had to give him a sack lunch because we were low-key down or we had to postpone his shower yard visit. He never got upset, like so many other hotheads did. He was a big, beefy dude and could have easily physically harmed a lot of my coworkers including myself, even with handcuffs on. The dude would work out for his entire time in the day room rec yard, but he was real quick to apologize and be nice to everyone, even the new COs. I'm sure you are thinking that this is just ploy to stoke a friendship, or maybe solicit COs, but he never once approached me to even so much as pass a magazine or newspaper down the cell block run. He was just cool, like a dude that fricked up at way too young of an age, and had the book thrown at him in the courtroom. I won't say his name, but he was executed in 2011, and at the time he committed his offense, he was 19 years old. My old supervisors would encourage all of the officers to not get online to look at offenses made by the inmates, because it could skew your judgment, provide a means of bias. But in this case, I did. He killed a couple guys running a crack house, and shot a 15-year-old girl in that same crack house. I'm not sure of all the details, but I always felt like there was more to his story. If it's who I think he is, MWM. I remember hearing about this from my grandparents when they lived in the area. Apparently the two guys he shot were his friends and the girl was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He never gave a reason why he shot the two guys though. Not a CO, but every person that came in contact with Edmund Kemper said he was well spoken and seemed like a gentle giant, until he started talking about his crimes. I think that's what makes him the most fearsome serial, in my opinion. Because with the way he talks and seems kind at first, I probably would have been a young dumb kid that would have gotten in his car too. His portrayal on Mindhunter is horrifying. The actor did an amazing job. Obligatory, not a corrections officer, but I am an intake mental health therapist, and we see a large number of people who are put on probation, respecting confidentiality and all. There was one guy I remember who was in his early 50s, had done some objectively horrible things, and it all stemmed from trauma reactions. He grew up severely abused and neglected, and he wanted so much to just be able to be left alone to live life, as he knew he couldn't function in society. It was heartbreaking. Former CO, but the thing that really strikes you is how normal they are. I had an inmate who was going through a rough divorce and got drunk, rode his bike up to his soon-to-be ex-wife's house and dismembered her with a kitchen knife and then fell asleep in his old bed. He would pace in his cell all night and tell people who asked he was just reflecting on how he got there, had never been in trouble before, was very intelligent, and was always very kind and caring. I maintain that if he ever got out, he won't. I would have a coffee with him and catch up. I've spent a year with a prisoner. I was fellow inmate. The sickest, most wild guy would talk to all the time and he was friendly and nice but would turn on you in seconds if you said something wrong. Super short fuse. Screaming off the handle. You always had a sense of no soul in his eyes. Hey, something I can answer. Nicest person I've probably ever met in my life. He was older gentleman, around 65. Always was early to everything. Was extremely polite. Addresses the CO's professional. And always helped keep the unit in line. It turns out he was in remand because he was on trial for a triple homicide. He was a hitman for the HA, and did a last hit on a competing gang as a retirement package for his family. He was the kind of guy that I would expect to be in there for tax evasion, not being a hitman. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.